Hello and welcome back to Workshop Wednesday. I'm Chelsea Buzzemeyer. Thanks for joining me today in my workshop. And today I'm going to share with you my top tips for beautiful buttonholes. If you've been following me recently, you've seen me work on the yoke of this shirt, the cuffs, the collar. If you're just looking for tips on buttonholes and have stumbled across this video and you want to know more about working on either men's shirts or ladies' blouses, there's a lot of great tips on all of those areas in these videos. So let's jump right on into today's content and look at the placement for your buttonholes. If you're using a commercial pattern, it will most likely show you where to put the buttonholes, how long, and where to place the buttons. However, as always with sewing, we can do anything we want, and depending on the garment's use, the body shape it's for, the fit of the garment, how much ease, you may want to adjust those details so it's more suited to your actual project. If you've used a larger or a smaller button, maybe a really thick, heavy one that's decorative, you may need to adjust the length of your buttonhole and all of those types of things. Now for placement is the first thing you'll want to think about. First, decide which direction is best for your buttonholes. On the case of a shirt, you always have the collar band button horizontal and the buttons running along the shirt going down parallel to that line. Depending on the tug that these buttonholes are going to experience, factor to deciding if you want to switch the direction of your buttonhole. Typically, you want the most pressure or tug on that buttonhole to be on one of the short ends. So since the collar will be pulled around the neck, that's the direction that it gets the most tug. You want that buttonhole to be horizontal. Now, I find here, especially if you have a very fitted blouse or a busty, it's almost like you need these buttonholes horizontal as well, but it is more common on a shirt to do those parallel to the edge. Oftentimes on coats, you'll see them horizontal, especially if they're like bigger buttons. But it is up to you and your own personal preference in just the style aspect of the direction of your buttonholes. There are different shapes of buttonholes on clothes. You're most likely going to use the square one, which is the most common. Once you're sure of which direction you want those buttonholes to be 110%, actually 200% sure on which side of the garment you want those buttons to be. There's no switching them around, so you really want to be sure that you've got them marked on the right side of the garment. For a cuff, it's easy to know as that buttonhole is on the side with the overlap for the slit, but you always want those to be kind of buttoned, folded over the arm. So the longer portion that rolls over the top of your arm is the piece with the buttonhole, and the button is going to go underneath on a cuff. For men's garments, you're typically going to have the left side overlapping the right side. So the right side's going to have your buttons, the left side's going to have your buttonholes. For women's garments, it was the other way around, as back in the day we had servants dressing us apparently, so they would be standing facing us and it would be easier if the whole world was right-handed. Once again, you're in charge of your project, so if you find it easier to have it one way than the other, you can totally do whatever you want. That's just kind of the general rule that fashion has taken on when you're deciding which way around your garment should overlap when putting in buttons. It is more and more common that everything is buttoned with the left side folding over the right side, even in women's garments, so it really doesn't matter. Just be 100% sure you've got the garment overlapped the way you want it for which side is your buttons and which side is your buttonhole. When it comes to placement, it's also important to think about how much ease you have in your garment. As I mentioned, most patterns will tell you where the placement should be, but if you like your garments really fitted, maybe you're really busty and you always find that there's too much strain on the buttons, then scooch those buttons closer together. I find especially in like cheap fast fashion, they'll just kind of pull that button spacing a little bit farther apart. If they save one button on each blouse and make 1,000, they're saving a lot of buttons. This is your project, so you can put them as close together or far apart as you want. Once you've got your direction, spacing, and placement covered, check the actual length of the buttonhole you want to add before you mark it on the garment. I always make sure that I mark my buttonhole and the buttonhole ends nice and square so that my buttonholes are the same length and are nice and straight in my garment and aren't a little bit offset in any which way. Let's take a look at how you would do this.
For a perfect buttonhole, you don't want your buttonhole to be too big and your button always to be popping out. And you also don't want that buttonhole to be small and it always be a battle or struggle to get that button done up. You want that buttonhole to be between 3 and 5 millimeters longer. That's about 1/4 of an inch longer than the diameter of your button. Depending on how thick your button is how you would know if you want to do more or less. If your button's really thick, you need that buttonhole to be a little bit bigger so you can get it through easily. If it's a super thin button, like a shell button or a metal button, it's probably going to slide in really easily, and you want to make sure you don't make that buttonhole too big and your garment come unbuttoned all on its own. So for this shirt, I'm going to make these buttons right about 1.5 centimeters in length. Now, a little trick that I do when I'm cutting open my buttonholes is I won't cut them open quite all the way the full length once I've put them in, just to test the first button. First, I'm going to put in the marking for the buttonhole on the collar band. I'm going to start by measuring exactly how wide my collar band is, and then just divide that by 2 so that my button is placed nice and centered in the width of the collar band. So I'm going to just mark this in here just for the center, or as the center marking. My collar band rounds down, so I'm going to just continue it straight. And then I'm going to go to this front edge and put in my cross marking. I have an overlap here of 1.5 centimeters. So I know right at 1.5 centimeters, square to the front edge and square to the marking that I have for the center of my collar band is where I want to have my buttonhole end. Now that I have the direction of the buttonhole and where the buttonhole is going to start, I can put in the line to follow to create the sides of my buttonhole, and I can also mark in my full length. So I said 1.5 centimeters was the length of the buttonholes that I was going to add to this shirt. So I'm going to put in my crossbar right at an angle there. Well, there's a little white flower here, so you can't really see it, but this is the length. And so now I have the exact length that I need, and I know it's nice and square to the edges of my collar band. So going down the center, your next buttonhole is always going to be placed closer to the top edge than any of the spacing of the other button. It's usually placed within a very short distance of the seam where the collar band is added. So for the spacing of where the buttonhole should be placed in relationship to the edge of this button placket, that will be exactly the center of your garment. It will most likely be exactly in the middle of your button placket. So for this shirt, the button placket is just folded over double. It's actually not stitched. If your garment had a stitched button placket, then you could definitely just measure the width there and divide it in 2 so that your button holes were running very nicely centered along that button placket. Here, I know I have, once again, 1.5 centimeters of overlap. So my buttonholes are just going to run at 1.5 centimeters from that center front line. And I'm just going to put in a little little line about the length of what I need just to use as reference. I love these rulers with the tiny squares for doing buttonholes, marking in buttonholes. And I'm just gonna measure down from the top. I'm gonna put that button placement right about 2 centimeters from that seam. Again, it depends on the garment, the size of your buttons. Since my buttons are pretty small, but the placement of where the button is going to be stitched on is right at the top of the buttonhole. So part of the button will be hanging over the top of this buttonhole. I don't want that button to get too close to the seam. I want it to be about 1.5 centimeters from that seam. So that's why I'm bumping down this edge to 2 centimeters down. So now that I have that marking, I can drop down and put in the marking that I need for the full length of my buttonhole, and so on and so forth. So now I have exactly the marking. So I'm going to continue from this one with the spacing that I want in between my buttons as I go down. For our cuffs, we're going to be marking our button placement on the top portion of the sleeve, the top portion of the slit, how it folds over, and we're going to just measure the exact width, full width again, of the cuff. On your commercial pattern, the button placement will most likely be exactly center in your cuff. Sometimes it will be a little bit lower, like closer to the edge, but in general rule is about centered for the cuff. So I'm going to use my ruler here and line up both the hem, exactly the edge of the hem, and also the edge of the slit itself, so that I can really get this placement exact right from the get-go. So for the placement here, I'm going to do 2 centimeters from the edge of the slit and 4 centimeters from the hem of the actual sleeve here. So my buttonhole is going to start right here. The length is going to be the same. These are just tiny little shirt buttons, so they just need a 1.5 centimeter buttonhole. So it's going to go from there to there, 1.5 centimeters, and exactly parallel to the hem. There we go. To stitch the buttonhole, you really don't need anything fancy. This is a super basic machine. I can't even choose like the length of the stitch I want for my buttonhole. It just has simply the buttonhole setting for the length of the stitch, and then I have the first half of my buttonhole, so the left side of the buttonhole, my 2 ends, and of course the right side of the buttonhole. So I'm going to start off just by putting it to the first half of my buttonhole. So we're going to get started with this buttonhole on the actual collar band, and you can see here I've got my button pressure foot on, and I'm just going to line up my bottom line with the bottom marking on the buttonhole foot, and I'm going to make sure that the center of my buttonhole is really nice and centered in this foot. I'm going to slide it up a little bit, and I always like to check where the needle is and make sure that the needle is kind of on the inside. For each side of the buttonhole, it's just zigzag stitch in a very narrow zigzag stitch, but I want to make sure that the inside of that buttonhole runs right directly parallel to my white marking. I'm going to put the pressure foot down here, and then we're going to stitch this buttonhole, the first half of it, all the way down. The most important part about stitching the buttonhole, other than the tension, is that the garment is being transported consistently or evenly throughout the entire length of that buttonhole. Now we've met up with our cross line of where the end of the buttonhole should be. We're going to close it off and head back up the other side.
if your transportation is not consistent, you're going to have areas in your buttonhole that are thicker and some that are thinner. Now, other than it not really looking nice, it's also not going to provide enough stability if it's too thin, if the spacing of those stitches is too far apart. And of course, it's going to get bulky if it's back stitching on the same spot too many times. You can kind of see here as we're heading back, there's just a little bit of fabric exposed in the center, and that's where we're going to cut into, right into that fabric when we're opening the buttonhole, because we really don't want to catch our stitches when we open it up. So I'm going to do the end on the outside a few times, and then I always like to just come back down the first side a few stitches, kind of like back stitching, because you don't back stitch on a buttonhole, but this just overlaps a little bit. So just a few stitches there before I pull it up. So there we go, we've got our buttonhole. Now, you may find that your machine transports nice and evenly when it's just like maybe the button placket, but on the collar it's too tight. You can kind of aid your machine in transporting more evenly, but it is definitely better if your machine can just transport it even and consistent throughout the whole button. You can go back and overlap if you have areas that there's just not enough stitching and transport it too quickly, but it definitely is preferable if you just have a consistent buttonhole all the way around the first time. Now, to cut a buttonhole open, I like to use scissors just because I feel like I have the most control. So I like to just fold it in half and just snip in the very center. Now, you want to make sure that you're not snipping your stitches at all. You're snipping that fabric in between, and just snip enough to actually get through all of your layers, and then unfold the button or buttonhole rather. And I like to slide just the point of my scissors into that buttonhole and just take tiny little snips just to make sure, like, never stick your scissor in all the way. You could snip through and actually cut open the end of your buttonhole. Just use tiny little scissors, or snips rather, to get that buttonhole open. I'm going to go the other direction now, so sliding it in and just snipping so that I catch the fabric and not my stitches. I also like to just not snip all the way to the end, stop a little bit short, and do kind of a test fit with my button. Just see, you know, how does this button pass through here? It's a little bit tight right now, so I'm going to just snip it a little bit more open, because even though I have this length of the buttonhole, if I don't snip it open the whole way, it leaves the buttonhole just a little bit tighter. And there's nothing worse than a garment where the buttonholes are too big and it comes undone on its own. Right here, since it's so thick with all of the interfacing and layers, it may need to be cut open a little bit more. I may find that the buttonholes on this placket part, since it's just fabric, need to be just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to once I've stitched this buttonhole, just cut it open a little bit shy of the full length and see how it feels. So this buttonhole is now passing through the hole really nice and easy, but it doesn't feel too loose. So this feels like a really nice size for my buttonhole. I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of my buttonholes on this shirt, just doing that same method over and over.
Now that all of my buttonholes are stitched and cut open, the next step is to align the garment how you want it to be when the button is done up. So I want this edge to be lined up. As I stitched on this cuff, I ensured that they were the same length. So this seam should cross over exactly even as well. So overlapping it as much as this cuff should be overlapped when this cuff is closed and the garment is on. And then you want that buttonhole, or that button rather, not to be placed in the center of the buttonhole, but rather to the edge where that button would be when that buttonhole is experiencing tug. So for this case, the cuff would be kind of pulled open. So I want my button to sit right at the bottom. So I want to dot right at the bottom of the buttonhole, so when it is experiencing tug and that button slides right to the edge, it's going to be exactly at the location I want everything to be sitting. So when I open it up here, I can see my little white marking. This is where I need my button to be. To stitch on a button, I like to actually use a double thread. So a double thread folded in half. I have it already folded in half. And then I'm going to slide this into my needle. So I actually have 4 threads on the go. You want to make sure that it's nice and smooth so that you don't get any tangles. So all 4 threads are exactly the same length. Sliding them all the way down. And once your needle is prepped, go and find that hole that you marked. I like to start from the back side always. Catch my button. So the nice part about having this heavy thread is that I don't have to actually stitch the button on that many times to have a secure hold. However, be aware of the thickness of your fabric when stitching on buttons. If you have a super heavy fabric, what's going on here? It seems like it's tangled. No, we're good. Yeah, if you have a really heavy fabric, you won't want to tighten that button up really close to your fabric. You'll want to leave a little bit of space. So you want that button to be stitched on securely, but not like smushed against the fabric, because when you close the button, when you button it up, all of the rest of this fabric needs to fit underneath. So I'm just going to stitch it on kind of lightly a couple of times. And then the last time I go through, I'm not going to go through the button. I'm just going to come out and I'm going to wrap my thread around the button a couple of times, just bringing it nice and tight, the threads together. I like to loop it, so twist it and loop it around before I go through the last time, after I've wrapped it, so it's nice and secure. And then poke it back through. And to finish off a hand thread, so I like to just catch a couple threads, just a couple threads of my garment, pull it through, and then before this loop of thread actually fully closes, I double back through with my thread so that the thread itself is actually holding kind of the tail end of my thread really nice and tight. And after I've pulled that off, or pulled that tight so that it's holding that nicely, I just stick my needle back through a section of the garment. Since this is a cuff and it's double layer, I can even do like a larger amount and pull that thread through so that the thread is actually underneath, inside kind of the cuff, in between the different layers, that little bit of a tail end thread, and then just cut it off flush with the garment right there. But you've got kind of that little bit underneath, in between the areas, keeping it from coming undone. And I'm also going to trim this little thread here. So just trim it off right close to the garment, and that little bit of tail end thread, that just keeps it from coming undone. So you've got a nice and secure hold. It's raised just a tiny bit so that when you button it up, you have a really nice transition and hold without the top layer of fabric kind of feeling pinched or needing to twist around. It's just a nice flat hold, and your button doesn't seem too loose, or it's not like dimpling into the fabric being too tight.
Well, there you have it. Those are my top tips for adding buttons and buttonholes to any garments. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll put the links to the other videos for this shirt down in the description box. So if you want to know more about colors, cuffs, all of those other things, look for that down in the description box, so that will be easy. And of course, hop on over to my Facebook group if you would like a little bit more support or want to be part of my community. I'd love to hear from you there or in a comment on this video. And of course, you can always subscribe to my channel here too if YouTube videos are more your style and you want to stay in the loop on everything that I'm sewing up in my workshop. So until then, happy sewing, and we'll see you again next week on Workshop Wednesday. Bye for now.